There is a rock in northeastern Wyoming that grew nearly 900 feet into the sky in a matter of seconds, according to at least 5 different Native American nations who have never fully agreed on much else about it, except this. And when you look at the sides of that rock today, you can still see what's described as the proof. Deep vertical grooves running from the base almost to the summit, spaced with an evenness that looks less like natural erosion and more like something with claws the size of teepee poles once tried and failed to climb it. This is Devil's Tower. And the story of what the Kiowa say is sleeping inside it isn't a single tidy legend. It's a story so consistently told by so many separate nations, the Kaiwa, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Crow, each with their own version, their own details, their own names for the same impossible rock, that even the geologists who've spent over a century trying to explain how it actually formed still can't fully agree on the answer either. Different languages, different casts of characters, different regions separated by hundreds of miles of plains territory, and yet every single one of them looks at the same tower and arrives at some version of the same explanation. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what the Kaiwa say happened at the base of that tower, why the vertical scars running up its sides have never stopped being called claw marks by the people who live closest to it, and why modern science, using instruments and field surveys the storytellers never had access to, still hasn't been able to fully explain how this thing was built in the first place. The Kiowa name for this formation is Tisu'ai, aloft on a rock. Other tribes call it something closer to Bear Lodge or Bear's Teepee. The Lakota call it Mato Tipila. The Cheyenne call it Nakovea, which also translates to Bear's Lodge. Different words, different languages entirely, and yet the same central image keeps surfacing across every one of them. A bear, a lodge, a rock lifted skyward. And according to the version passed down through the Kaiwa people, who are recorded as having lived in this region generations ago, the story begins with something almost unbearably ordinary. A group of children playing near their village, far enough from camp that no one was watching closely enough. According to the Kaiwa telling, 7 little girls were playing at a distance from their village, close to a stream where bears were known to gather. The bears noticed them, and the girls ran. They ran as hard as they could back toward the safety of their village, the bears closing the distance behind them with every stride. And when it became clear they weren't going to make it, the girls did the only thing left to do. They scrambled up onto a low rock, barely 3 feet off the ground, nowhere near tall enough to actually protect them from anything. And one of them, out of options, began to pray. "Rock, take pity on us. Rock, save us." And the rock listened. According to the story, the ground beneath the girls began to rise, not slowly, not gently. The low outcropping they'd climbed onto for a moment's safety started pushing upward, lifting the 7 of them higher into the air, faster than the bears chasing them could react. The bears reached the base of the rising stone and leapt after it anyway. Desperate, claws extended, raking against the sides of the formation as it climbed away from them, into the sky. This is where the story stops asking you to simply imagine something and starts pointing directly at physical evidence you can go stand in front of right now. Because in the Kiowa telling, and in nearly every version told by the neighbouring nations who share this story, those claw marks didn't fade. They're described as the long, deep vertical grooves that run up the entire face of the tower today. Grooves so consistent, so evenly spaced, that from a distance they look almost too deliberate to be an accident of geology. The girls kept rising. The rock kept growing. And according to the Kiowa version of the story, they never came back down. They rose so high that they passed beyond the reach of the bears entirely, beyond the reach of the earth itself, and became the 7 stars of the Pleiades, a cluster still visible in the night sky above the very rock that carried them there. 7 girls, 7 stars, one formation that, according to the story, is still standing exactly where it stopped growing, its surface still carrying the marks of the moment it saved them. If this were only a Kiowa story, it would already be remarkable enough. But it isn't only a Kiowa story, and that's where this gets harder to dismiss as a single tribe's imaginative folklore. The Lakota tell their own version of essentially the same event, with details specific enough that it's clearly not simply a retelling of the Kiowa account, but its own independent tradition converging on the same physical explanation. In the Lakota version, it isn't 7 girls. It's 2 boys wandering far from their village who stumble across a giant bear named Mato, a creature so massive that his claws were said to be the size of tipi poles. Mato spotted the boys and gave chase. The 2 ran until they had nowhere left to run, and like the girls in the Kaiwa story, they dropped to their knees on a low rock and prayed, not to a nameless spirit, but specifically to Wakantanka, the creator. And the ground answered them too. The earth shook and a pillar of rock began lifting the 2 boys straight up into the sky, almost 1,000 feet according to the telling. Mato reared onto his hind legs and clawed at the rising stone with everything he had, tearing long vertical gouges into the surface as he tried and failed to reach them, covering nearly every face of the mountain in the same long cracks and scratches described in the Kiowa version. The boys were eventually carried the rest of the way to safety on the wings of Wombly, a giant eagle, rescued not by the rock alone, but by 2 separate acts of aid arriving exactly when they were needed. 2 different nations, 2 different casts of characters, 7 girls in one telling, 2 boys in another, 2 different rescuing forces, divine intervention alone in one version, an eagle's wings in the other. And yet both stories agree independently on the same core physical claim. A low rock rose suddenly and violently into the sky to save children from a bear, and the bear's claws are the reason the tower's surface looks the way it does today. That kind of convergence across separate oral traditions maintained by separate nations, without a shared written record to copy from, is exactly the kind of detail that should make you look a lot closer at what's actually carved into that rock. Even the Kiowa poet and novelist N. Scott Momaday carried this story as part of his own identity, given the name Tsoai-Tali, Rock Tree Boy, by a Kiowa elder specifically to link him to the bear myth, a connection his family reinforced by bringing him to stand at the base of the tower itself, as a child, and one he later wove directly into his own published fiction. This isn't a story that stayed frozen in the past. It's one that individual families have continued actively passing down generation to generation into the present day. And when modern geologists did look closer, they ran into a problem the storytellers never had to deal with. They couldn't agree on how it actually got there either. The earliest formal scientific theory, published in 1907 by geologists Darton and O'Hara, concluded that Devil's Tower was the eroded remnant of a laccolith, a mass of molten rock that had pushed up into the sedimentary layers above it, but never actually broke through to the surface, cooling underground into the shape you see today only after millions of years of the softer rock around it wore away. That theory held for decades, but it was never the only one. Other geologists have argued the tower is instead a volcanic plug, the hardened throat of an actual volcano, left standing after everything else around it eroded into dust. The problem with that theory is almost as strange as the formation itself. If Devil's Tower really was the neck of an erupting volcano, you'd expect to find evidence scattered across the surrounding landscape. Ash, lava flows, volcanic debris, something. And for over a century, none of that evidence has turned up anywhere nearby. Either it eroded away as completely and thoroughly as the tower's supposed volcanic siblings, or the tower was never part of an eruption at all, a genuine unresolved gap sitting at the center of the most straightforward-sounding explanation. In 2015, a geologist named Prokop Zavady proposed yet another explanation entirely, comparing Devil's Tower to a similar formation in the Czech Republic, and suggesting it might be the result of a maar-diatreme volcano, a rare kind of eruption caused when rising magma encounters underground water and flash boils it into a violent expansion of steam. It's a genuinely different mechanism than either of the earlier theories, proposed more than 100 years after scientists first started seriously trying to answer this question, and it still hasn't settled the debate. What everyone does agree on is the timeline, that this happened somewhere around 50 to 60 million years ago, during the Eocene, when molten rock intruded upward into the sedimentary layers of what's now northeastern Wyoming and eventually cooled into solid stone, before millions of years of erosion stripped away the softer rock around it and left the harder igneous core standing alone, exposed, towering nearly 900 feet above the Belfort River. And they agree on the columns, hundreds of long, roughly hexagonal columns of phonolite porphyry, some stretching over 500 feet from base to summit and averaging 4 to 6 feet across, formed as the molten rock cooled and contracted from the outside in. Geologists call this columnar jointing. It's the same physical process that produces the claw marks in the story. And on this specific scale, it's rare enough that Devil's Tower is regularly cited as one of the best examples of it anywhere on the planet. The rock, quite literally, tore itself into vertical strips as it cooled, and whether you call that a geological process or the record of a desperate bear, you end up looking at exactly the same lines on exactly the same stone. So here's the part of the story where two very different kinds of certainty run headfirst into each other. The Kiowa, the Lakota, and the tribes who share this tradition have never needed satellite imagery or petrographic analysis to explain those vertical grooves. They've had an answer since long before anyone thought to bring instruments out to the Black Hills. And modern geology, with every tool available to it, still hasn't produced a single, fully agreed upon origin story of its own. The tower's more recent history hasn't made the tension between these two worlds any simpler. In 1875, an army expedition led by Colonel Richard Irving Dodge passed through the region, and Dodge's interpreter, translating the tower's indigenous name, rendered it as Bad God's Tower. By the time that translation made its way into English language maps and reports, it had been shortened to the name most people use today, Devil's Tower, a name that has nothing to do with what any of the tribes who actually named this place ever called it, and everything to do with one interpreter's mistake more than a century ago. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt designated it the very first national monument in the history of the United States, using the newly passed Antiquities Act to protect it under a name that erased the meaning the surrounding nations had given it for generations. Nearly a century later, in 2004, a coalition of tribes formally petitioned Congress to rename it Bear Lodge National Historic Landmark, restoring the name that had actually meant something to the people who told its story first. The petition failed. A second attempt a decade later, brought before the US Board of Geographic Names, failed as well. The name on the map still doesn't match the name in the story, and the mismatch is more than symbolic. It's a small ongoing reminder of exactly whose framing of this place has historically been allowed to win. And there's one more layer to this, one that plays out every single year, right now, in the present tense, not buried in a congressional record from 2 decades ago. Devil's Tower is legally open to climbers year-round. Roughly 4,000 to 5,000 people summit it annually, following routes that didn't exist when the tower was still simply Mato Tipila or Tsuai. But since 1996, the National Park Service has maintained a voluntary climbing closure every June, the month when many of the tribes connected to the tower hold their most significant ceremonies at its base. It isn't a legal requirement. Nobody is fined or arrested for climbing during that month. It's a request, exactly the kind of request that took Uluru on the other side of the world decades and multiple deaths before it was finally honoured as law instead of just a sign. At Devil's Tower, that request has worked, at least partially, without ever needing to become a law at all. Park data shows the number of climbers who choose to summit during June has dropped by roughly 85% since the voluntary closure began. Not because they're forced to stay off the rock, but because enough of them, given the context of what June actually means to the people who have told this story for generations, have simply chosen to climb somewhere else instead. Climbing advocacy organisations, including the Access Fund, have publicly backed the closure, and most professional guiding outfits in the area simply stopped bringing clients to the tower for the entire month, treating the request less like an inconvenience and more like a standard people in the area have quietly agreed to honour without needing a law to enforce it. So when you ask what the Kaiwa say is sleeping inside Devil's Tower, the honest answer is that nothing is technically inside it at all, the same way nothing was ever technically inside Uluru. What's there is on the surface, written into the stone in lines that two entirely separate nations, telling two entirely different versions of the same rescue, both point to as proof. A bear that almost reached 7 girls or almost reached 2 boys and left claw marks either way, on a rock that grew because it was asked to. Modern geology may eventually settle on a single, fully proven explanation for how those columns actually formed. The laccolith theory, the volcanic plug theory, or Zavada's maar-diatreme hypothesis, one of them someday backed by evidence solid enough to end the argument for good. But even then, it won't erase the fact that the people who have lived beside this rock the longest already had their answer and their evidence, long before anyone thought to bring a geologist out to check. Do you think those vertical grooves are simply the record of how cooling rock cracks apart over millions of years? Or do you think the oldest explanation, carved by claws desperate enough to leave permanent scars in stone, deserves more credit than modern science has ever been willing to give it? 7 nations, several thousand miles of plains territory, and over a century of geological fieldwork later, and the argument still isn't settled either way. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.